So there's something I've been noticing for a while, and I just can't stop thinking about it. And it has to do with trauma, or more specifically, how we view traumatized characters in movies and television shows. Because I'm starting to notice a consistent pattern, a double standard. I've noticed that when a male character goes through something traumatic and they become violent, selfish, irrational, and start making terrible decisions because of that trauma, they're often labeled as deep characters. They're complex. He's a tragic hero, stuff like that, which is often true in many cases. However, when a female character acts out of the grief, pain or the trauma that she's been through, she's often dismissed as being, unlikable, poorly written, being dumb and too emotional. I've just seen it everywhere. And I can already hear someone saying, maybe the male characters are just better written and performed than the female ones. And that may be true. Or maybe there's something deeper going on where we as a society have this inherent bias towards male characters over female ones. And we're going to dive into that in this video. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at 3 characters that are male and 3 characters that are female. And what they all have in common is that they both been through trauma and ended up doing terrible things because of that trauma. And we're going to contrast them with one another and see how some audiences reacted to some of those characters over the others and the bias that stems from that. So we're going to be looking at movies and shows from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We're also going to be looking at characters from Euphoria, the HBO TV show. And we're going to be looking at characters from the Last of Us HBO series. So if you haven't seen any of those shows and want to do so, I would click away because they're going to be heavy spoilers in this video. Now, if you've already seen them, or if you haven't seen them and you just don't care, then you may proceed. Now, before we even get into that, we first need to identify what this double standard is, why it exists, and where does it come from. So let's get into it. So what exactly is this phenomenon, and how did it come to be? Well, it really just boils down to cultural and social double standards, which have existed for centuries. We've been socially conditioned to see male pain and male trauma, and the destructive behaviors that stem from that trauma and pain, as tragic and meaningful. Meanwhile, female pain and trauma, along with their reactions to it, are often dismissed as being irrational or hysterical. This double standard also explains why it's socially acceptable for men to express pain through anger or lashing out, while women are expected to stay composed, nurturing, and emotionally controlled, even when they're suffering. And if they deviate from that expectation even slightly, they're quickly labeled as being crazy or too emotional. And the irony is that in society, women are often labeled as crazy or too emotional no matter what they do. So it's no surprise that this also manifests in the way that audiences react to certain types of media. So here's a good example of what I'm talking about. Let's think of a popular male character that has gone through trauma, like Batman for instance. So he saw his parents murdered right in front of him when he was just a kid. And this trauma manifested into him putting on a costume and risking his life every night, fighting a war against crime that will never end, all in the name of vengeance. His trauma makes him act out by being violent towards criminals, cold towards the people who love and care about him, and pretty hard-headed and stuck in his own ways. And yet he's still seen as a hero and an iconic and compelling character that everyone loves. However, on the flip side of this, you have a character like Galadriel from Rings of Power on Amazon, who, like Batman, also loses family in a traumatic way, having her brother killed by the Dark Lord Sauron during a war. She then too becomes obsessed and hellbent on vengeance, dedicating the rest of her life to searching for Sauron so she can enact her revenge upon him. Galadriel, just like Batman, is also a character who, due to their trauma, is cold towards the people she's closest with, and really hard-headed and irrational at times. However, only one of these characters is seen as unlikable, arrogant, too emotional, or annoying. And I'll tell you what, it's definitely not Batman. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Male characters seem to have more leeway to be raw, unfiltered, and damaged in some way than female characters do. Female characters always need to be perfect, pure, and on their best behavior, or else they'll get lambasted and called bad characters. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So let's get into the main examples I want to explore in this video that showcase this double standard and how it manifests in the way we view media. So we're going to be starting with Loki and Wanda Maximoff, 2 of the most broken characters in the entire MCU. So let's start with Loki. So Loki grows up in a magical kingdom called Asgard as the second son of Odin, who's the ruler of Asgard. From a young age, Loki grows up feeling like he's second best. Even though he's technically a prince,
He grows up feeling like he's always in his brother Thor's shadow. Their father clearly favors Thor, grooming him to be king, while Loki is kind of just sidelined. And as it turns out, Loki's feelings aren't totally unfounded, because later on, he learns that he's not actually Odin's biological son at all. He's actually a frost giant, which is a race of people Asgard has been at war with for centuries. Odin found him as an abandoned baby and raised him as an Asgardian, without ever telling him the truth about his heritage. Not only that, but Loki discovers Odin adopted him not just out of compassion, but also with a political goal in mind, to one day unite the Frost Giants and the Asgardians through Loki's heritage. That plan never came into fruition. So in Loki's eyes, this makes him more of a political pawn than a beloved child. This revelation shatters his entire sense of self. Everything Loki thought he knew about himself, his family, his life as he knew it, crumbles in seconds. So this sends him down a dark path. In the first Thor movie, he betrays his own family and tries to seize Asgard's throne, and even attempts a genocide, literally trying to wipe out the Frost Giants to prove he isn't one of them. And in the first Avengers film, Loki literally invades Earth, kills hundreds of innocent people, manipulates people's minds, and causes tons of destruction. And yet, despite all of this, audiences loved him. And why? Because he's charming, funny, and undeniably charismatic. And of course, fans understand that his trauma influenced him to do these terrible things. So fans instantly fell in love with him despite the terrible things he did, because he was a likable villain. And later on, when he gets a redemption arc, learning to be a better version of himself in Thor Ragnarok and his own Disney Plus series, audiences celebrated his growth and rooted for him.
So let's talk about Wanda Maximoff now, who's been through just as much loss, if not more, than Loki, and has also done terrible things. And yet, fans weren't as gracious with her as they were with Loki.
So Wanda grows up in a war-torn country called Sokovia with her twin brother Pietro and their parents. One night when she's about 10 years old, a missile hits their apartment building, killing her parents instantly. In the explosion, Wanda and her brother are trapped under their bed, and another missile lands just feet away from them, but it doesn't explode. For 2 days, they sat there, terrified it would go off at any moment, and luckily it never did. That's how Wanda's life began, surrounded by fear, death, and loss. Many years later, she and her brother volunteer for dangerous experiments in the hopes of protecting their country and getting back at the people they held responsible for their parents' death. These experiments help to unlock their powers, but later on, Pietro's killed in battle not long after they join the Avengers, and then years after that, in Avengers Infinity War, Wanda is forced to kill the man she loves, Vision, to try to save the world and stop Thanos from completing his Infinity Gauntlet, only to watch him die a second time minutes later when Thanos reverses time and takes the stone from Vision anyway. By the time WandaVision begins, she's lost everything, her entire family, her parents, and her partner, all in violent and traumatic ways. So when she ends up in the small town of Westview, her grief completely overwhelms her. Without fully realizing it, she uses her powers to create a false reality, a kind of perfect sitcom world where Vision is alive again and they actually have 2 children together. But the catch is, this illusion traps the real residents of the town inside of it, controlling their minds and forcing them to play along in her fantasy. She takes away their free will, and even when she starts realizing what she's doing, she resists letting go until the very end of the series because it means facing her grief again. And then later on in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, that grief of hers turns into obsession. After finding out the fake kids she created in WandaVision actually exist somewhere in an alternate universe, she goes on a hunt to find them, hurting and killing anyone who stands in her way, including heroes. By the end of the film, she finally understands what she's become and sacrifices herself to stop it by collapsing a tower on herself, seemingly killing herself. And that's the last we see of Wanda in the MCU.
What's unfair is how different fans treat her compared to Loki. I mean, Loki has literally tried to commit a genocide in the first Thor film. He invaded Earth and killed hundreds of people, innocent people. He's caused chaos throughout different timelines. Loki is not a good guy, or at least he wasn't a good guy. And yet fans were still able to, resonate with him and root for him, despite him being a villain. Maybe it's because he's funny and charming, and that's why people excuse his actions. That's something you see in society too. The most charming and funny guy can get away with a lot of bad stuff. But just because Wanda isn't cracking jokes and being charismatic does not mean that she's not going through the same trauma and pain as Loki is. And fans aren't as, open to understanding that. I've even seen a lot of fans saying that if Marvel chooses to bring Wanda back, they won't be open to a potential redemption arc from her the way they were with Loki. Keep in mind, Loki and Wanda have both done terrible things and killed innocent people and caused tons of destruction. Yet, they're open to Loki being redeemed, but now Wanda potentially being redeemed. And that, my friends, is called a double standard. Now let's talk about Euphoria, which is a show, an HBO show about a group of teenagers dealing with love, grief, addiction, and the highs and lows that come with high school. And, it covers a bunch of characters as they navigate that in really raw and messy ways.
Nate Jacobs, one of the main characters, is this confident, popular football player, but underneath the surface, he's full of anger and confusion. He grows up with a father who secretly records himself sleeping with men and trans women, something Nate discovers as a child. That trauma completely warps his sense of masculinity and identity, so he becomes controlling, manipulative, and violent. He emotionally and physically abuses his girlfriend Maddie. He blackmails people, he assaults people. Nate is truly a sociopath in the show. But underneath the surface, he's a traumatized little boy trying to feel powerful and in control by hurting people. And while fans are aware of how evil and reprehensible Nate's actions are, they're still very empathetic towards him. Like, they don't justify his actions, but they understand that he's a traumatized kid that inherited toxic masculinity from his father. They take his trauma and pain very seriously. Then there's Cassie Howard, who's a soft-spoken girl desperate to be loved, who's another morally questionable character with trauma of her own. When she was just a kid, her father, who struggled with drug addiction, walked out on their family and never came back, which gave her trauma, abandonment issues, and daddy issues. She spends high school being sexualized and looked at only for her body, and she leans into it. She believes that love, especially male approval, is the only thing that makes her worth anything, and a lot of boys took advantage of that, including Nate. In the second season, she starts secretly hooking up with Nate, who's not only toxic in his own right, but also her best friend Maddie's abusive ex. She truly spirals in this season. She starts lying to everyone around her, crying and having breakdowns in the bathroom, and losing her sense of self, entirely just to be chosen by Nate. Because Cassie unfortunately has validation issues and desperately needs to be loved, even if the person loving her is a complete scumbag like Nate.
And the reaction online was brutal. Cassie's desperation became a meme. Her crying in the bathroom was turned into a, viral TikTok audio. She was just basically made the punchline of the entire season.
And that's not to excuse what Cassie did, because what she did is really messed up. She literally betrayed her best friend just to feel better about herself. But I just find it weird how, despite Nate continuing to be abusive, violent, and manipulative, actually got way less hate this season than Cassie did, despite him literally being evil.
And like I said, I don't think audiences, like the terrible things Nate does or even justify it. But I do feel like they're more open to giving him, giving his trauma and the actions that he does because of that trauma more weight and seriousness than they give Cassie's, who they often just make fun of and reduce to being a dumb little girl.
Now, me personally, I think Cassie is way more complex than a lot of people give her credit for. I truly think if she was a male character, the audience would be way more open to trying to understand her psyche, instead of reducing all her complexities down to her being a dumb pick-me character.
Now let's talk about The Last of Us, which is an HBO show based off of the popular and critically acclaimed video game series of the same name. Now this is a show that is set in a post-apocalyptic world where everybody's turned into zombies, and we follow survivors as they try to make their way through all of this. But it's not really about zombies though. What it's really about is love, grief, and survival. It's a really great series and I definitely recommend it.
The main character of the first season is Joel Miller, who's this cold and hardened smuggler who tragically lost his daughter on the day of the outbreak, and one of the most devastating and tragic scenes in video game and television history. 20 years later, he's tasked with escorting Ellie, a 14-year-old girl who's immune to the infection, across the country to a hospital so they can make a cure from her. At first, Joel doesn't like her. He's distant, guarded, and focused only on survival and getting her to where she needs to go. But as they travel together, their bond deepens. Ellie slowly starts to break through the walls he's put up due to his grief, and she becomes like a daughter to him. But when they finally reach the hospital, he finds out the only way for them to make a cure is for them to kill her, and he cannot let them do that. So he kills everyone in that hospital and saves her, even though it means dooming humanity, which is something that will come back to haunt him. And Ellie doesn't even know what happened, because she was unconscious through all of it. So when she wakes up, Joel lies to her. He tells her that her immunity meant nothing, and that the doctors just gave up on looking for a cure.
It's one of the most debated and talked about endings in media ever. And a lot of people agree with what Joel did. They make, a lot of justifications for what he did. He was just a father protecting his new daughter.
But Joel's not just protective, he's also violent. We see him kill without hesitation. We see him torture people for information, beat people to death, shoot first and ask questions later. It's also implied that in the early years of the apocalypse, Joel did some terrible things to stay alive, even killing innocent people when he had to. Joel is not a good man at all, but people just don't talk about him that way, because we understand why he's the way he is. He's the classic sad dad archetype, the broken hero that we root for because we understand his pain.
But then when we look at Ellie, you see how that sympathy suddenly disappears.
Early in the second season, Ellie is forced to witness Joel's brutal murder, when survivors of his hospital massacre in the first season come back to get their revenge. It's traumatizing. The one person she trusted the most, the man who gave her safety, family, and purpose, is taken from her right in front of her eyes in the most brutal way possible, and it breaks her. After that, Ellie starts to unravel. She becomes impulsive, selfish, and angry. She becomes consumed by revenge, to the point where it's all she can think about, and at the expense of everyone around her. In her quest for revenge, we see her kill and even torture without hesitation. Now, she admittedly does a lot of reckless and irrational things throughout season 2. Throughout this season, we see her lash out at the people closest to her, lie to those who try to help her, go into situations completely unprepared, and endanger the lives of all her friends in her single-minded pursuit of vengeance. When someone goes through something traumatic, it completely changes the way they think and the way they approach the world, making them more susceptible to making reckless and dangerous decisions. So Ellie being quote-unquote dumb and short-sighted, that isn't bad writing. That's just an accurate depiction of trauma. She's doing exactly what Joel did, letting her pain consume her and letting her trauma dictate every move she makes.
But instead of people saying she's grieving, she's just traumatized, instead of extending her the same grace that they did Joel, people online were calling her annoying, calling her, unlikable, saying that the character was badly written and they made her dumb. And that says something about the way we watch stories. If we understand that pain and trauma is complex and can make male characters complicated and multifaceted, why don't we do the same for female characters? Why don't we extend them that same courtesy? Maybe the problem isn't how these female characters are written. Maybe the real problem is how we as a society have been taught to interpret female characters and women in general. Because even in real life, women who are grieving and angry and in pain are not extended the same grace as men that are going through the same things, even when they're reacting to the exact same trauma. And that's something we need to change as a society. And with that concludes our video for today. I would like to thank everybody for watching, and let me know what you think. Tell me whether I was wrong, right. Tell me how you interpreted them. Just give me your perspective. Leave a comment, below. And of course, if you like content like this and look forward to me uploading more stuff like this, I would invite you to like and subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so you can be alerted every time I drop a new video. And with that, take care, and I'll see you next time.